All right, thanks, Rachel. Well, I'm happy to be here with you today, and it is beautiful outside, so I think we've lost some folks to the outdoors calling, which is completely understandable. I'd be out there myself if I wasn't in here. So as Rachel mentioned, I'm at the University of Tennessee, and tonight we're going to be talking about the ins and outs of organic fertilizers, and there's a lot to talk about, but also, as she said, feel free to jump in if you have a question or type it in the chat and she can interrupt me and let me know because I don't really check the chat while I'm talking. So I wanted to start with a little about soil fertility. And soil fertility, when we talk about that, we just are talking about the capacity of that soil to receive or store and then pass on the nutrients that support plant growth. So it's talking about that nutrient status of the soil and the ability of the soil to provide nutrients in turn to our plants. So there's three different components of soil fertility. First is the physical component. So that's the actual mineral or parent rock, and then things like compaction and aggregation. And then there's the chemical component. So that's going to be the nutrients and the pH, and we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. That's probably the area that we'll focus most on. And then the biological side, or the microorganisms. And that's really key in any soil, but even more of a focus in organic systems. And we're not going to talk about it specifically, but we'll talk about it here and there throughout the next hour or so. So the nutrient requirements for all plants, and you often hear about the NPK, which are some of the macronutrients, but regardless of whether you're a conventional or an organic grower, the crop nutritional requirements are going to be the same. So we have the macronutrients there on the left. Besides the NPK, we have calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. And then we have the micronutrients on the right. And those are not less important. We just need less of them. And that's why we call them micronutrients. The source of the nutrients is what's going to change depending on what production system we're using, not the quantity or the quality that we need. So plants themselves don't differentiate if something's an organic or a non-organic fertilizer, but they can only absorb nutrients in certain forms, regardless of their source. So that'd be NO3 or ammonium, NH4 plus for nitrogen, and then the potassium ion for potassium. And this is Liebig's law of minimum. And I like this because it was a German chemist, but his law was that the nutrient that is deficient or lacking will limit plant growth. So we focus on those big three, but if we have any limitation in our nutrients, that's what's going to limit our plant growth. Also, factors, what we call abiotic factors, moisture, temperature, as well as our insect control and light and plant populations and genetics of the plant varieties will also play a role, but we need to make sure we have enough of all the nutrients that we need. So soil pH, we'll revisit this when we look at some soil tests later, but this is really important when we're talking about nutrients, because if your pH is out of whack, then absorption of the nutrients from your plants is also going to be thrown off as well. So pH is just the concentration of hydrogen ions in your soil, and it's measured on a logarithmic scale. So it goes from 1 to 14, with 1 being really acidic and 14 being very basic. Going back to high school chemistry here. Most of our vegetable crops need a pH between 5.8 and 7. So potatoes and sweet potatoes are going to be on that lower end, that 5.8 end, because they like the soil slightly more acidic than a lot of our other crops. Southern peas are also on that end. But you'll notice if you look at this graphic there on the right, that most of these nutrients have wide bands in that 6 to 7 pH range. And then as we deviate from that, so as we get more acidic, as we go towards 5, you'll notice that those bands are narrowing. And then as we go the other direction, so as we get more alkaline, they also narrow out. So they're most available in that 6 to 7 range generally. And if we get too far out of there, then our nutrients are going to be less available. And the micronutrients are going to be less available at high pHs, as you can see. And when we get below 5.5, we can start seeing some toxicity. So we can see some aluminum toxicity. And so that's why pH is a really important part of your soil test, because you want to make sure that your pH is in that range where your nutrients are going to be most available for your plants to uptake them. And the only way we can determine that is through a soil test. So we'll talk a lot about soil tests tonight too. So this is from our soil specialist here at UT. He always says, don't guess, soil test. And both UT and the University of Kentucky have soil testing labs that you can send off samples. Here in Tennessee, you can go to your local extension office and they'll give you a box like this one down here on the left-hand corner. And you can go throughout your field and take random samples with a soil probe or a spade if you don't have a soil probe. But you're going to go down between 0 and 6 inches. So you want to get to that depth of 6 inches and randomly take samples throughout your field. Then you're going to mix them in a bucket so it's representative of the field that you took it from. And then you'll put it in that box and either take it or mail it to the soil lab, and then they will send you back an interpretation of your results, and they'll tell you whether you have a sufficient range or you need to add components, and we'll look at that. But we also have this little fact sheet on soil testing as well, which can be handy. So how much do you need? As I mentioned, we have the Soil Plant and Pest Center here in Tennessee. I might have gotten that wrong. It might be the Plant, Soil, and Pest Center, but I think it's the Soil, Plant, and Pest Center. And that's their website. A basic test there is going to be $15, and they'll give you your pH, and then phosphorus, potassium, and calcium, a lot of those macronutrients, and then some of the micros. So magnesium, manganese, iron, copper, sodium, and boron. They do have other tests that you can add on there that will tell you about your organic matter and your soluble salts, as well as your sulfate and nitrate. So nitrate's one that you don't automatically get, and that's generally thought because it varies widely between the time you get your test and when you might be going to utilize that field. You can also get information on your CN ratio and container media and particle size. And then they also do plant tissue analysis, which we see more and more to get real time during the season, what's going on with your plant nutrients in the plant itself. And that way we can make course corrections if we know that a plant is missing something during the season. So after you get your, this isn't your test results, but these are the kind of recommendations they will send you back. So on the top we have for cabbage, so they'll tell you that the total amount of nitrogen you need is 90 pounds per acre. Down here with the cucurbits or vine crops, you need 30-40 pounds. And then they'll go through if your phosphorus test comes back low, medium, high, or very high. Generally, if you get very high for phosphate, you're not going to need to add any, as you can see in both sets of crops here. Same for the potash. If you're very high, we're not going to add anything. But then it'll tell you exactly how much to add for your operation. And it'll tell you also if you need to add boron. So some crops often do better with a little boron. So cabbage is one of those. Excuse me. So what actually makes certain fertilizers organic? Organic fertilizers are going to be carbon-based, and so they're derived from living organisms. And examples of organic fertilizers are fish emulsion, which is what we use through our drip system extensively at our organic farm. Smells terrible, but it's one of the best liquid fertilizers you can use. Or blood meal is another example. Excuse me, compared to inorganic fertilizer that doesn't contain carbon and are usually manufactured. They're often water soluble. So organic fertilizers are typically going to be slow release. So you need to plan and make sure that you have them on there in advance, because you're not going to get more of an immediate reaction as many folks are used to with water-soluble synthetic fertilizers. So in the case of organic fertilizers, the microorganisms in the soil are going to transform those nutrients into plant available forms. So this can take days or can take weeks. And so you have to be aware of that when you're putting them down. Not all fertilizers that claim to be organic are OMRI certified or approved. So if you are certified organic, you want to make sure you go on the OMRI list, and that's the Organic Material Review Institute. And their top of their website is there at the bottom, but if you just Google OMRI, it'll come up. And they update their list of approved substances quarterly. So you want to make sure that you check back, because oftentimes something can be on their list and then they might change an inert ingredient in the product and then it goes off their list. So you want to make sure, especially if you're certified organic, that you're always in compliance and you check that list often. So some of the benefits of organic fertilizers, one is that gradual release of nutrients. So that means over time, it's going to ensure season-long supply of nutrients instead of just a burst right when you put it on and then it's gone. Also, there's minimal loss to the environment because these are less soluble than those water-soluble fertilizers, and there's also less salt injury with them. Another contribution is adding organic matter to your soil. So that's going to help with that soil health. That's going to help with building the microbes in that soil, as I talked about in one of those first slides. And then that can also help with increasing your water holding capacity and your cation exchange. So water holding is becoming ever more increasingly important with reduced amounts of water. We hear about this in California all the time. Here in Tennessee and Kentucky, sometimes it feels like we have too much water. Like before this start of this week, we had about 5 days in a row of rain and a substantial amount. So, but later on in July and August, we'll be in that same boat. We won't have regular rain. And so water holding capacity can really help reduce your overall water use over time. Stimulating the microbial activity, I already mentioned that when we talked about soil health, and just improving the structure of your soil. And that really helps as well. It helps your plants have a good base from which to grow from, and it can provide valuable micronutrients to your plants as well. A few of the drawbacks of organic fertilizers are, just like its slow release, it's not going to be readily available to the plants compared to the soluble, boy, I'm tongue twisting today, soluble synthetic fertilizers. They also generally are going to have a lower NPK grade. So that's going to require larger amounts that you have to apply, and that can get expensive. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. Often the nutrient levels are more equal, so 1-1-1. Maybe supplying nutrients that you don't need in order to meet your nitrogen demands, and it can often lead to over application for things like phosphorus. And in Tennessee, we tend to have soils that are naturally high in phosphorus. And as I already mentioned, they can be more expensive compared to inorganic fertilizers, although this year of all years, all fertilizers are very expensive. So how do you go about choosing your fertilizer? First, you want to go to that soil test and you want to compare your results to what your crop needs. That's always the first step. You don't want to just throw some on, because in the case of fertilizers, more isn't better. If we're supplying too much, then we're going to have our plants can go vegetative and we're not going to get the fruits and vegetables that we want. And we're just wasting money if we're applying too much. So the soil test is really important. Next is the nutrients that you need. So what does the soil test tell you? What is the nutrient content of your fertilizer? Do you need everything in that fertilizer? Or do you already have enough phosphorus? So you want to get something like this NatureSafe product that's 1008. It's not going to be adding more phosphorus. And that's really important, that you tailor your product to what you need. And then your application method. So pre-planning your fertilizer and broadcasting it may be your only option that you have, or do you need something that is water soluble, or do you have fertigation set up and so you want to be able to run something through the fertigation system? Those are all important things to consider when choosing your products. Then it really comes down to your production philosophy. So do you only want to use locally sourced amendments? And this is the sticky wicket when we're talking about organic fertilizers, and we'll talk about that more. But a lot of the organic fertilizers are from very far away from Tennessee and Kentucky. And so now they're taken out of the ocean or wherever you're getting these substances, and then they're shipped all the way to you. And so they tend to have a higher carbon footprint if we're shipping them around all around the world versus things that we can get locally. So we'll talk a lot about things that we can procure a little more locally today. And then, are you certified organic or transitioning to organic? Do you need those OMRI certified products, or do you have some wiggle room? Then the price. So how much are you willing and able to spend? And shipping is always a big deal. If we are shipping those things in, the shipping costs can be about as much as the product itself. So you want to think about that if you're buying things online, or even if you're buying them from a supplier and you have to travel to get them. So generally, we don't have a lot of these available in large quantities locally. So it's often a thing where you have to travel to get them or have them shipped online. With the co-ops in Tennessee, they do say if you go to your local co-op in your county, that they can get just about anything you need from their main office in Laverne. So I've had people try this with varying degrees of success, but if there's an input that you know you need, that might be the first place you want to go is your co-op, and ask them if they can get it ordered for you and get it through their main location in Laverne, Tennessee. As with most things, fertilizers are typically going to be cheaper if with a larger order. So you want to think about that too. Maybe get a few growers together in your area if you're all using the same sort of fertilizer, so you can defray the cost that way by getting a larger order. I know we used to get a lot of our inputs from Seven Springs, and a lot of the growers in East Tennessee would get together and we'd have one big order. So a whole truck would come and deliver it to a local point here for us, and everybody didn't have to drive to Virginia to pick up their orders. So what soil amendments can be used in organic production? Lots of things are on this list. This is not exhaustive, but it gives you an idea of what's allowable. So those aquatic plant extracts, elemental sulfur, humic acid, magnesium sulfate, but it has to be the mined type only. Micronutrients like nitrates or chlorides are not allowed. Soluble boron products, and then sulfates, carbonates, oxides, silicates of zinc, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, selenium, and cobalt. Liquid fish products are allowed to be used. There was a rule that the National Organic Program changed a few years ago with liquid products, fertilizer products. They can't have nitrogen above 3% because there was a company that was supplementing their nitrogen with non-organic sources and higher percentage of N in their products. So they changed that a few years ago. So make sure with your liquid products, they don't have more than 3% nitrogen. Potassium chloride can be used if it's derived from a mine source. And then sodium nitrate or Chilean nitrate, it can be used, but for no more than 20% of the crop's total nitrogen requirement. So the sources of nitrogen can include things like manures, and we'll talk about those, and cover crops. We'll talk about those a lot because those are things that don't just have one benefit for fertility, but can have many benefits for your overall system. And that's really, when we're talking about organics, we really want things that'll do more than one thing in our system. Plant products, animal byproducts, seaweed, and then of course Chilean nitrate. So those last two, seaweed and Chilean nitrate, are coming from far away to get here. So again, you have to think about your fertilizer philosophy there. Some sources of phosphorus are, again, manures and composts, rock phosphate, which we have an abundant supply of here in Middle Tennessee. We had brown rock phosphate mines for many years, phosphatic clays as well, and then bone meal and guano. But again, if you're shipping in guano, it's coming from further afoot. And then sources of potassium, and you're probably noticing some repetition here with the manures and compost. So they're going to provide NP and K manures and compost. So we'll talk about them in greater detail. And then other sources like green sand and langbonite, potassium sulfate, rock powders, sylvanite, and wood ash. And a little wood ash always goes a long way. So you want to make sure if you're using wood ash, because folks say, well, we had to cut down these trees on our farm, so we burned them, and now we have all this ash. A little wood ash goes a long way, and you want to be careful there. So this is a nice table that Rachel made up or found somewhere, but it talks about the different types of amendments you can use and their nutrient content, and then their nitrogen availability and some comments about them. So bone meal, it's in here twice. It has an NPK range from like 4 or 1 or 3. So it's going to vary depending on the product. And you want to make sure you're paying attention to that when you're buying the product. And we'll talk about how you calculate how much you might need later on. But seeing those ratios at the beginning of the NPK is really important to know how much you're going to need of a product. So it's quite a difference if you have 4% nitrogen or 1% nitrogen in there. So you always want to look at that. Feather meal is going to be higher. It's about 12 to 13% nitrogen. Both of those are going to have moderate nitrogen availability. It's not going to be one that's water soluble. So again, you have to think about that when you're putting it on. Sodium nitrate, that's the Chilean nitrate. It has 16% nitrogen. But it can also cause some sodium buildup in your soil. So that's part of the reason why they're keeping it to 20% of your nitrogen, but also because it does act often more like a synthetic than an organic fertilizer. So fish emulsion, it's one that's going to be rapidly available, and its nitrogen percentage is going to range from about 4 to 9%. Some are going to be acceptable for certified organic production, but not all. So you want to make sure that, again, you're reading that label if you're certified organic, and make sure that it is one that is approved for organic production. It can be applied via fertigation, as I mentioned, that's what we use, but it does clog emitters. So you're going to have to unclog it fairly often. So add that to the list of things you'll have to do if you're using fish emulsion. It is a great source of nitrogen, especially for plants during the season, and it's easy to put through a dosatron or another injector type, but you do have that clogging problem. Manures and compost are going to vary widely, and it's going to depend on the source. It's going to depend on the animal. It's going to depend on what the animal was fed. It's going to depend on the age of the animal. These are usually going to be applied pre-plant and incorporated, and we use them as a phosphorus source, not necessarily a nitrogen source. So they do have some nitrogen as well, and we'll talk about that more later on. Magnesium sulfate or Epsom salt, it's going to have that high percentage of magnesium and sulfur. It is water soluble, and it can be applied via fertigation. Gypsum is one that's going to have high calcium and high sulfur. We can use it to lower the soil pH. It's a good source of sulfur, and we broadcast it before planting. We'll talk more about lime as well. It's going to be used to raise our soil pH. So if we see we have low soil pH, we can use lime to raise it, but it must be applied months before planting because it's going to take some time to work properly. And the size of the particles are going to matter. So the smaller the particles of your lime, the faster they'll work. And then elemental sulfur. It's going to be used for lowering soil pH. It's especially used for blueberry plantings to keep that pH low in blueberry plantings. But it also needs to be applied months before planting to work. So now we talked about different sources of fertilizers you can use, and cover crops, as I mentioned, are really a good one because they're going to have a variety of benefits, not just providing nutrients to your crop. So there are cover crops, the legume crops that do nitrogen fixation, but cover crops are also going to have biomass that's going to improve your soil quality and your organic matter. They're going to help prevent the loss of nutrients and soil loss. So many cover crops are going to really recover nutrients from the soil for you, so they're not lost to leaching when you have rain events. Cover crops are also great for weed suppression. They're good for rotations. They bring in those beneficial organisms, which really help you with your pest control. They can also help with your water quality. They're a mulching material and more. So when you're using a cover crop, yes, you're getting a nutrient benefit, but you're getting other benefits as well. So just like with the organic fertilizer list, there's also some drawbacks of using cover crops. So that can be direct or indirect and opportunity costs. So are you using them when you could have a cash crop in that same space? They can slow the warming of the soil in the spring. And that's one of the biggest things. They can slow down your field prep because you're waiting. You have to do those extra steps of getting in there and terminating that cover crop before you can get in the field. And so you want to think about all those things and make sure you can time it out just right. Some cover crops can also immobilize your soil nitrogen, so you want to be aware of that as well. And some can also increase your pest and pathogen issues. So we're going to go through some of the steps of using a cover crop. So first we want to identify what function we want to get from that crop. So what's limiting production in your system? Is it low nitrogen fertility? Is it your soil structure? Is it just crumbling? You can't get plants to grow. It's terrible soil. Is it erosion? Or is it something else like weeds or pathogen populations? For tonight's purpose, we're talking about fertility, but there are all these other added benefits, and you can tailor the cover crop to your needs. So what function can that cover crop serve for your vegetable and small fruit system? Next, and this one's really important, is identifying that cover crop planting niche. So where does it fit into your crop rotation? Do you have a niche in between your spring crop and when you're planting warm season things, where you might have a short window for a warmer season cover crop? Or after your spring crops, are you going to let that soil rest, so now you have a longer window for a warm season cover crop? Or do you want to get them in there between your cool season crops or in the fall right before winter to keep that soil covered? Or are you going to plant them with the cash crops in the row middles? So you want to think about that niche. Where does it fit in? And then you want to define that timing for your critical cash crop operations. So what's making you the most money that you need to get in on time? And you want to make sure that your cover crop isn't going to conflict with the timing of that cash crop or crops. The third step is selecting the cover crop that's going to meet those goals from steps 1 and 2. So you want to consider the benefits and drawbacks. A perfect fit is not usually likely, so you're going to have to make some concessions somewhere. You want to consider the cost and availability of seed, because that's another step in there, and we'll look at an example of that later on as well. And then the management costs. So do you have what it takes to terminate that crop? And that can often be an issue because you might get some biomass going and then you think, oh, we thought we could control this, but it grew much more than we thought it would. And we particularly see that when we're using cover crops in high tunnels. So it's important that you have a way to manage that crop and then ultimately terminate it at the end of the season. And when we're talking about organic production, we're not using herbicides to burn it down, to terminate it. So you want to make sure you have the machinery, whether that be a roller crimper that you're running through your field to lay it down as a mulch later on, or if you need to chop it up. So some of the costs to consider with cover crops are, of course, the direct costs. So that's going to include the seed and then however you're establishing it. So are you tilling and then broadcasting it, or are you drilling it in? And then I already talked about that termination. Are you mowing it? Are you tilling it? Are you rolling it? We did do some organic herbicide trials with a cover crop several years ago that were unsuccessful, but it's a kind of a good story. So we had a roller crimper and we used it on cowpea earlier in the season and it worked beautifully. So in the fall, we wanted to try it again. And when we went to roll it down, it wasn't dried down enough. It was very moist and it just popped back up every time we would roll it with our roller crimper. And we did this like 3 times and it kept popping up. We couldn't break the stems because it wasn't really ready to terminate, but we needed it to terminate to get in a broccoli crop. So then we decided it was going to be an organic herbicide trial to see what we could terminate this cover crop with. So we used vinegar and we used clove oil and we sprayed it, and then we planted our broccoli transplants in there. And it was the weekend. We came back on Monday and every transplant that was in our clove oil treatments had been eaten, probably by rabbits or some other sorts of animals. So the broccoli clove oil combination apparently was more appealing, and somebody ate all of the transplants out of there. So that was the end of our trial because we didn't have any more broccoli transplants. So anyway, you need to have a way to terminate it. But I will say, in organic systems, organic herbicides are also very costly and generally are just going to burn the crop down and it will come back. Oftentimes we don't terminate the growing point with organic herbicides, so they'll just pop back. It'll take a little while. And so if you have a crop that vines out, they might cover the soil and shade out the weeds before they grow back. But other crops that don't have that vining out capability, organic herbicides probably aren't the way to go there. So then you have indirect cost as well. So did it interfere with your cash crop because of the soil temperature, or it tied up nitrogen, or it drew in some pests you didn't anticipate? Other management issues. So did it get too large for the equipment you had to terminate it? Did it get weedy? Did it bring in diseases that you also didn't anticipate? And then those opportunity costs. So if you had to forfeit some of your income, if a cash crop alternative was feasible during that time. So now we're just going to talk about a few options that are fairly commonly used in Tennessee and Kentucky for cover crops for vegetables and strawberries. So we have 2 different classes, the cool season and the warm season annuals. And then within each of those, we have legumes and non-legumes. So the legumes are going to be those nitrogen producers. The non-legumes are going to be grasses and broadleaves. And we're going to talk about examples of all of these, and you'll see why in a second. So crimson clover is one that we use extensively at the UT Organic Farm. It's one that we can plant in mid-fall, and it's going to give us really rapid spring growth. And then in about the middle to the end of April, our field looks like that. So just covered in beautiful red crimson clover blossoms. And it's going to give us a nitrogen contribution of 50 to 150 pounds per acre. So that's a significant amount of nitrogen. But what I wanted to say now is in that first year, when you terminate that cover crop and till it under, you're only going to get about 20% of that nitrogen into your crop. So you want to make sure you factor that in too. We talked about that slow release, and in that first year, you're only going to get about 20% of that 150 pounds if you get that much. So you want to consider that. Crimson clover is great because it also grows well with mixtures with small grains like rye or triticale or wheat. And oftentimes we do recommend doing mixtures of cover crop instead of just a single cover crop. And the reason for that is it's like crop insurance, right? So if one of those doesn't come up well, you have another cover crop that comes in and takes up that space, but also because they fill different niches that I talked about earlier. So with a legume, you're going to get that nitrogen production. With the small grains, you're going to get a lot of biomass, so they're good for choking the weeds out. So if we plant them together, we're getting multiple benefits at once. Crimson clover is also a really good pollen source, but it can potentially be a disease bridge with vegetables. So you want to be aware of that as well. Generally, Dixie is the most common cultivar that we see of crimson clover. Other cool season legumes would be things like hairy vetch, which we also use a lot of. Some people don't like hairy vetch because it can become weedy, but we never mind. We like our hairy vetch. And winter peas, another good one as well. So some of the non-legumes, so cereal rye, and this one shouldn't be confused with rye grass. It's one that's often used because it's very cold hardy. And while it's not a nitrogen producer, it is a good nutrient scavenger. So again, we want to prevent those nutrients that we maybe purchased and applied from being leached from rainwater. So cereal rye is a good scavenger to keep them up in that root zone. It's also really good for early and late season biomass. It can be allelopathic, so you want to be careful. The crops, generally with smaller seeded crops, we see the allelopathy, like lettuces and things, so you want to be aware of that. And these are just a few of the varieties that are fairly common. So Wren's Abruzzi, Wheeler, and Elbin. Another cool season non-legume is annual rye grass. So this one is also a good nutrient scavenger. We often see it in the row middles, especially for things like strawberry plantings, and you can see it there in the photo. And it's really nice because especially when we have strawberries that are fairly early season, we can tend to have a lot of rain, and this is a great way to keep the row middles from being a muddy mess if we have that ryegrass there. It's also good at scavenging the nutrients for us. So again, we're getting more than one benefit. It is good, a good biomass producer, and it does have some nitrogen and some moisture. The residue isn't going to persist as long as the cereal grain because it is more of a grass. And it can become weedy without herbicides. So it does have more limited use in organic systems, but it is still used. Then there's the brassicas, another non-legume, mustards, rapeseed, canola, radishes. So forage radish is often used. That's what's pictured here at the top. Arugula. They're also good for pest suppression as long as it's non-brassica rotation. So you want to be mindful of that. If you do grow a lot of brassicas as cash crops, then you might not want to put them in your cover crop mix because you're not going to be breaking those disease cycles and pest cycles. They are also good nutrient scavengers, and their winter hardiness is going to vary. All right, so the warm season legumes. Sun hemp is one that's been gaining popularity for many years now. When it first came to the US, it's more of a subtropical to tropical cover crop, and about 10 to 15 years ago, the seed was super expensive, but now the costs have come down. It's going to be another rapid biomass producer, and it can give you 120 pounds of nitrogen per acre in just 9 weeks. So it's fairly quick. It does best in very warm conditions because, as I mentioned, it's subtropical to tropical. It's still limited by seed cost, but it has gone down significantly. And this one can also be suppressive to root knot and reniform nematodes. Other warm season legumes that we often use, and the one we use most often at our farm, is cowpea. We like to get a nice crop of cowpea in there, and we can notice an immediate change once we till it under in our fields where we use the cowpea. And soybean is another good one. So a few cover crop management resources. We want to make sure that we're planting it at the appropriate time. We want good seed to soil contact. For planting rate, date, and method information, we have a few UT Extension publications. So the Forage and Field Crop Seeding Guide for Tennessee is a good one to get those seeding rates. If you don't already have a copy of this book, down in the right-hand corner, Managing Cover Crops Profitably, you can go to the SARE website and download a copy for free. You can also order a hard copy if you prefer, but it is an excellent resource, and it goes through the benefits and potential challenges with every cover crop you can think of, so you can really tailor it to what you need for your farm. Then we also have the UT Extension fall cover crop selection and planting dates in Tennessee. So we did a trial about 15 years ago now, where we looked at September, October, and November planting dates. And then we look at single cover crops and combinations of cover crops. And so that publication shows you the kind of stand you can expect to get depending on which month you plant it. November is generally too late for us here in Tennessee to plant our cover crops, but September and October will work. And it has some good information. And then the Southern Cover Crops Council is another good resource as well for cover crop information. So manure use, that's another thing that is plentiful here in the Southeast. The use, manure is used on 15.8 million acres, or 5% of crops in the US. Half of it is generally on corn, and that's mostly dairy and swine manure, because we have a lot of corn in the Midwest and a lot of dairies and swine in the Midwest. In the Southeast, we have a lot of chicken houses, and so broiler litter is plentiful, and it's often used on corn and peanuts and cotton and hay and pasture, but also used on vegetables as well because it's plentiful. So this is information from the ASAE manure production characteristics. Excretion by broilers: 12,000 tons of nitrogen, 8,000 tons of phosphorus, and 8,000 tons of potassium. The typical nutrient content is going to be about 60 pounds of nitrogen, 50 pounds of phosphorus, and 50 pounds of potassium for approximately 3%, 2.5%, 2.5% fertilizer. So as of February 2022, broiler litter is $80 per ton, or 98 cents per pound of nitrogen, or about 50 cents per pound of phosphorus, and 67 cents per pound of potassium. So as far as fertilizers go, that's fairly cheap. However, whenever we're using raw manures, we want to also consider the food safety side. And I'm the produce safety lady for Tennessee, so you can't get away without getting the little food safety in here. But some of the steps you should take to reduce the potential risks for food safety are applying that manure to crops that aren't intended for fresh consumption. So putting it in your rotation when it's not a food crop, or maximizing the time between the application and harvest of your vegetable crop, or not contacting the edible portion of the crop during application. You don't want to side dress with raw manure because it's going to cut into when you're harvesting that crop, and that's not good. And then you want to minimize the risk to adjacent produce crops if you're field spreading it. So you want to think about both wind and how the water is running from one field to the other. In the National Organic Program, there are minimum application intervals for raw manure. So those intervals are 120 days, applying it 120 days before a crop where the edible portion is going to touch the soil. So things like melons, carrots, potatoes, all of that, you have to apply that manure at least 120 days before harvest of that crop. For crops where the edible portion does not touch the soil, it has to be applied at least 90 days before the crop is harvested. And these are minimum application intervals. More is even better. When the food safety rule came out, they had a 270-day rule. They got a lot of flack for that and a lot of pushback. And so now the food safety, produce safety rule is following this National Organic Program standard as well. But another thing you can do to make manure safer and also more stable for its nutrient content is composting it. So when you're composting it, either yourself or buying in compost, it must achieve a temperature greater than 131 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 days to kill harmful food pathogens, or for 15 days if it's in an aerobic system. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. But aeration is going to help maintain that hot phase, or what we call the thermophilic phase, and turning it's going to allow the entire pile to heat up to that more than 131 degrees to make sure it's killing anything that's in that pile. So this is the most common composting option that we see, and this is just making a pile of compost either on the farm or if you're buying it from someone else, and then turning that pile. So again, you have to get to that 131 degrees, and in a turn and compost system, it has to be at that 131 for 15 days. And within that time, you have to have a minimum of 5 turnings. And then you're going to follow that by curing of your piles. And this little gizmo there on the right is a compost turner, which is pretty fancy. On our farm, we generally just use our bucket on the front of our tractor to turn our pile of compost, but we try to turn it, and you need to make sure that that pile is staying moist, because moisture helps with that temperature and keeping it alive and going. So whenever I talk about manures or compost, especially with organic folks, I always throw in there that there are some hazards of using manure and compost. So you want to be very certain of your source, and you want to ask a lot of questions if you're not making it yourself and you're buying it in. So there are several classes of herbicides that don't degrade during composting. And then once you apply that compost, you're distributing it to your whole field. And it can either be taken up by the produce, or it can have an herbicide effect on your vegetable plants outright. And tomatoes are very sensitive to this. So the class of herbicides is the Aminopyralids or Clopyralids. A common trade name that's used on pastures is Grazon. So the animals will be feeding on a pasture where Grazon was sprayed. They'll ingest that pasture, or the forage in the pasture, not the pasture itself. And then that herbicide will remain active through their system and in that manure, and then through the composting process. So if you apply it to your field, essentially you've just applied an herbicide to your field. And for organic folks, that also knocks you out of certification, because you did apply a prohibited substance, even though you didn't do it intentionally. Another example is arsenic in broiler litter. So it's a good idea to have, if you're using broiler litter, have that as one of the things you're testing for, to make sure that you're not applying arsenic to your vegetable crops, high levels of arsenic to your vegetable crops. With the herbicides, we generally don't test for it, because every herbicide testing is very expensive, and you need to test for each one that could potentially be there. So it gets really expensive really fast. So if you are buying in compost or buying manure from somebody, or even getting it for free, you want to make sure you're asking those questions, what they've sprayed on their pasture, so you can make sure that you're not going to have this issue on your farm. The other thing with it, besides knocking you out of organic certification, it can kill your plants outright, or make them so they might survive, but they're not going to produce anything. And it's in your soil now. So I've never gotten a weed scientist to give me a firm answer, but what they do tell me is that it can last in your soil for years, and it's going to depend on your environmental conditions. So the sunlight, it's going to depend on the rain that's going to leach that chemical out of your soil. So I get more and more calls every year of people that are frantic because they applied compost, or even they used hay as a mulch and it was sprayed with Grazon, and now they don't know what to do because it's going to be in that field for years. So please be aware of that. The other thing is the biological risk. So if a compost doesn't reach proper temperature, plant pathogens aren't going to be killed. So basically you're inoculating your field, and the weed seeds aren't going to be killed either. And now you're going to have a lot more work if you don't get it up to temperature and you have a lot of weed seed in there. Here's one of those evil pigweed that can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds, one from one plant. So checking the temperature of your pile is really easy. You can get a compost thermometer, which just looks like a really long meat thermometer, and you stick it in the pile. So it's getting into the center of that pile, and you're just going to take the temperature in multiple places in that pile and make sure you're at that 131 or above. Biochar is another amendment that's gaining a lot of popularity and attention. I know just enough about biochar to be slightly dangerous, but our soil specialist, Forbes Walker, works extensively with biochar, but all biochar is not created equal. It is a charcoal-like material. It's typically going to be produced from woody biomass, and it's decomposed at high temperatures in the absence of oxygen. It can also help with water management and improve poor soils, and it's going to modify the soil chemical and physical properties of your soil. So it's going to help with your cation exchange, your plant nutrient holding capacity, your water holding capacity. Some can modify the pH. It's going to give you some phosphorus and potassium, and it's going to increase your carbon sequestration. But again, all biochar is not created equal. This is a rapidly evolving area, so just beware if you're using biochar that it's a trusted source. So I said we'd get back to lime and liming products. In organic production, not all sources of lime are allowed. So mined limestone, calcium carbonate, and dolomite are permitted for use, but things like quicklime, calcium oxide, or burnt dolomite, which is magnesium oxide, or slaked lime, calcium hydroxide, and magnesium hydroxide are prohibited. So you want to be aware of that. And as I mentioned earlier, that particle size can be important. So now we're going to jump into a few examples, and Rachel put these together. So this is a University of Kentucky soil test that this is for growing tomato. And you can see here that their lab results, they had very high phosphorus, they had medium potassium, they had medium magnesium there. And then this site is irrigated, it's well drained. They're going to grow these on black plastic mulch. So the recommendations are 30 to 60 pounds per acre of nitrogen prior to planting, no phosphorus because we had that very high result, 70 pounds per acre of potassium, 20 pounds of magnesium. Another thing that's important with tomatoes is the Hartz ratio, and this is basically a ratio of the potassium and magnesium. If that ratio is less than 0.35, you're going to see a greater chance that you're going to have ripening disorders like yellow shoulder or blotchy ripening. We particularly see this again in high tunnels because we get the nutrients out of whack in the high tunnel. So high tunnels, we don't have that overhead rain that can balance out a lot of our nutrients. We can tend to get buildup of things in the tunnel, and those nutrients can get out of whack. And we see that in our tomato disorders often. So the guidelines for the tomato crop, the University of Kentucky has their ID 36, which is their recommendations for production, for nutrient and fertilizer application. It's based on conventional practices, but it can still be useful for organic folks as well. So the recommendation for phosphorus is 31 to 60 pounds per acre. No yield increase has been shown by having more than 60 pounds of phosphorus per acre. And we often in Tennessee have high levels of phosphorus, especially vegetable folks. So you want to be aware of that. Recommendations for potassium are going to be 200 to 300 pounds per acre. And for magnesium, 200 pounds per acre. And again, that recommended pH is going to be about 6.5 to 6.8. So at that higher range of the range I mentioned on the pH slide earlier. So again, recommendations for nitrogen for a conventional system are going to be to apply 50 pounds per acre of nitrogen before planting, and then apply 30 to 50 pounds of nitrogen post-planting as the fruit are setting, or split it up in weekly applications with fertigation. So soil nitrogen is not going to be a part of a regular UK or UT soil test. It's something you could add on, but we know we need nitrogen every year. For organic growers, we're going to front load all or most of that nitrogen at the beginning of the season. Because of that fact that many organic fertilizers are not water soluble, and it's going to take time for those nutrients to release. So adding organic matter like compost can help moderate that pH and add NPK. But again, you want to know what you're applying and where you got it so you don't have any issues there. So this is one product, Nature Safe, it's 1008. So in the case where we have that soil test where we had very high potassium, it's good that you match your product with what you need. We don't need any phosphorus. So we have 0 phosphorus in this product. We have 10% nitrogen. We have 8% potassium. And you'll notice that the nitrogen is in 3 different forms. So there's ammoniacal nitrogen, there's water insoluble nitrogen, and water soluble nitrogen. And it's 0.75% of water soluble and 0.25% of ammoniacal nitrogen. So in the general information, it mentions that 1% of water soluble nitrogen is going to give you green up in 7 to 10 days. The other 9% is water insoluble. So it's going to be your slow release for 7 to 9 weeks. So that's a really important thing to note. All right, so how do we calculate fertilizer need for a crop? And here on every bag of fertilizer, it's going to give you the percent by weight of those 3 major nutrients, so your NPK. So in this case, we're looking at feather meal, and it's 12% nitrogen, and it's 0% phosphorus, 0% potassium. So now, for every bag, you're going to multiply the weight of the bag by the percent to get the actual nutrient content of the bag. So if this is a 50-pound bag, we have 12% nitrogen or 0.12. And so that means we have 6 pounds of nitrogen contained in this bag of fertilizer, this 50-pound bag. So now, if we're applying this to a 30 by 96 foot high tunnel, that's 2880 square feet or 0.066 of an acre. So if we go back to that pre-plant application for our tomato crop, we need 50 pounds of actual N per acre. If we want to use that feather meal, now we divide the desired rate by the percent in the bag. So 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre divided by that 0.12. That's going to mean we need to apply 416.67 pounds per acre of our feather meal. But we don't have a whole acre, right, that we're applying it to. We're just applying it to 0.066 acres. So now we're going to take that amount per acre and multiply it by our fraction of an acre that we're applying it to in our tunnel. So in this case, we would apply 27.5 pounds of feather meal to one 30 by 96 foot high tunnel. All right, so we talked about testing your manure and compost because the nutrient levels can vary widely depending on the type that you're using, also by other considerations, animal age, what they ate, etc., etc. So, and also the age of the manure can make a difference too, because oftentimes we'll lose nutrient value over time. So this is an example of a manure / compost test from University of Kentucky. So it's going to tell you your results in pounds per ton. So this poultry manure had 42 pounds per ton of nitrogen, 37 of phosphorus, 52 pounds of potassium, 28 calcium, 9 magnesium, and less than a pound of zinc, copper, and manganese. So you would go through the same sort of process if you're using compost or manure. So let's say we're broadcasting on a 1/4 acre, and this is for bell peppers, which we also need 50 pounds of nitrogen pre-plant per acre. And we want to use that poultry manure. Our manure test results came back as 1, 1.5, and 2.6% for NP and K. So now, just like we did with the feather meal, we want to divide that desired rate by the percent. It's not in a bag now, or it might be in a bag, depending on how we get our poultry manure. So if it's 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre divided by 1%, now we need 5,000 pounds per acre of poultry manure. But again, we're not applying it to a whole acre. We are applying it to a quarter acre. So 5,000 times a quarter is going to be 1,250 pounds of poultry manure for our quarter acre. So now when we go back, we saw a few slides ago that poultry manure is going for about $80 per ton right now. And so it would cost you about $50 to apply this if you need 1,250 pounds. So fairly reasonable. What about the other nutrients? So manure is a complete fertilizer. How much P and K are you applying as well? So you're going to do the same thing. You're going to multiply the amount of the fertilizer you're applying by the percent of P and K in the manure. So we calculated it based on the nitrogen, and we know we need 1,250 pounds to get the nitrogen that 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre that we need for our crop. But now we multiply it by that 1.5% for P and the 2.6% for K. So we're going to be applying 18.75 pounds of phosphorus and 32.5 pounds of potassium. So the question you need to ask yourself before you apply it is, do you need that extra P and K? And oftentimes, especially with broiler litter, we can see phosphorus build up as well. So you want to be aware of that. So this is a little bit on economics, and I swear we only have a couple more slides and we're done. So we talked about how much it would cost you to apply broiler litter to an acre. So that was a quarter acre. We need 5,000 pounds for a whole acre at $80 a ton. That's 2.5 tons. So that would cost us $200 an acre to apply broiler litter. Some other organic fertilizers, they can get expensive pretty quick. So here's just an example. Fertile Earth Friendly is going to be $22.49 for a 25-pound bag. Nature Safe is going to be $39 for a 25-pound bag. And Harmony Fertilizer, which is the cheapest one of this bunch, is going to be, and it's a 543, is going to be $19.25 for a 25-pound bag. So if we go back to thinking about pounds per acre from our previous example, it would cost us $200 with broiler litter. With this Harmony product, to get 1,000 pounds of fertilizer to give us that 50 pounds of nitrogen we need pre-plant for our peppers, it's going to cost us $770 per acre. So this is where they can add up. And again, this one was the cheapest out of these three that we listed there. Now, if we compare that to a cover crop seed, so vetch seed is about $2.24 for a pound. And we generally seed out around 40 to 50 pounds per acre of vetch. So that's going to be $112 per acre in vetch seed. And that vetch seed in turn is going to give us about 81. So it's kind of overshooting what we need. But again, it's not all going to be available right away. So compared to our other fertilizer, which would cost us $770 per acre, the vetch is going to cost us $112 per acre. And then we have the broiler litter in the middle that's about $200 per acre. So you can see the benefit of incorporating cover crops and manures and compost that are locally plentiful. So the takeaway message from all of this is annual soiling testing is highly recommended. Don't guess, soil test. You don't know what to put on if you haven't tested it. Focus on your most valuable crop, especially if it's a fruit-bearing crop. The plants don't distinguish between nutrients if they're organic or inorganic. You can calculate how much of a particular fertilizer can be applied. Don't guess again, have your manure or compost tested so you know exactly the nutrients in there that you're dealing with. and if you're going to be over applying something that you don't really need more of in your soil. And when implemented correctly, cover crops can be used with or in place of fertilizers and really give you a good bang for your buck.